What? What? Can't hear you. Welcome to the deafened condition on this episode of Conditions in D&D. So the deafened condition is pretty simple. Just means you can't hear, and that you fail any checks that would rely on hearing. Now the deafened condition is one of the rare conditions, but fascinating one. While the actual definition doesn't give us much, there's a lot that is implied and a good DM can really take advantage of. For example, a deafened creature means they obviously can't hear their allies. Having one of the players be deafened or multiple adds a unique dynamic to communication, as they can't speak to try to coordinate their attacks, and therefore have to find alternate, more creative ways of doing so. This also holds true for the enemies. Enemies that make coordinated attacks or have advantages from being able to communicate with each other wouldn't get that benefits. Maybe enemies that would benefit from like pack tactics wouldn't always take advantage of that if they were deafened, as they can't hear each other and coordinate their attacks. Additionally, if there's a one clear leader who's delegating his subordinates, they wouldn't be able to, say, carry out those orders the same way if they were deafened. So you have like a flesh golem. Can flesh golems be deafened? Either way, for example, they go berserk and have to be calmed down by their master. If they're deafened, they couldn't be calmed down. Furthermore, the hobgoblin's leadership ability or the orc chieftain's battle cry ability wouldn't work, of course, on any of their subordinates that couldn't hear them. Additionally, it can assist in stealth by deafening someone in watch. They might not be able to hear you as better, or at all, obviously, and making stealth easier. I guess they're not keyed off as well if they were blinded or some other dramatic effect that would alert them, since deafened is a more subtle condition. Additionally, creatures like bats, killer whales, hook horrors, dark mantles, things like that rely on hearing for their echolocation would be essentially blinded if they were to be deafened, as they could not use their echolocation. Now, one of the unfortunate aspects of the deafened condition, much like the restrained or prone conditions, is how often creatures are immune to it. But fortunately with deafened, it's normally easy to tell. If a creature doesn't have ears, then they normally can't be deafened. Now, there's not many effects that actually impose the deafened condition. Blindness, deafness, divine word, storm of vengeance, silence are the only spell effects that do so, at least in the player's handbook. The Androphinx's roar, as well as Bronze Dragon's lair action, impose deafness. But besides that, there aren't that many creatures that impose that ability, so often the spellcaster is the one to do so, and even so, that's not seen very often. Effects that end the deafened condition are mass heal and lesser restoration, but often the deafened condition isn't permanent, so it isn't really much of an issue. But the deafened condition can be more than just a minor annoyance. It can also prevent class abilities from being useful, like danger sense and feral senses, requiring hearing and the like. Now, you have to be potentially careful with the deafened condition, because by imposing it on an enemy, some of your effects require them to be able to hear you, and those will no longer be valid. Additionally, it's an interesting way, like the prone condition, because it has advantages when imposing it upon yourself. By being deafened, you're also no longer subjugated to effects that require you to be able to hear the enemy for their effects to work. The main class that requires healing for their abilities to work is Bard. Bardic Inspiration, Song of Rest, Counter Charm, and Cutting Words all require the target to be able to hear you, which are now all invalidated. Many spell effects also require the target to hear you. Compulsion, Divine Word, Dissonant Whispers, Suggestion, spells like that are normally pretty intuitive to whether or not they require a target to hear you. Suggestion and compulsion definitely makes sense why you're able to hear you, but it's always good to check the rules. But this is, again, a two-way street. You can't put it on enemies, but enemies can't put it on you if you deafen yourself. Some effects like Intimidating Presence or Turn Undead require the target to be able to see or hear you, which deafening them could potentially have sight still be an option, but if they rely on blind sense, well then that is something to consider. Also, it might be advantage to deafen yourself if you know you're going up an enemy that has a attack that only works if you can hear them. Banshees, gibbering mouthers, Ferox, Chasmes, Harpies, creatures like that, that all have powerful effects and affect creatures that can hear them, could be very creative and interesting to use the deafened condition on yourself, and encourages, once again, you have to be mindful that, again, cooperation, the verbal component, is removed. But it is certainly encourages creativity in communication if you choose to do that. And I certainly think that's an interesting way to tackle an unusual enemy. Additionally, spells that only have verbal requirements means that if you're deafened and you can't hear the person casting the spell, you can't counterspell it because you not know that they actually be casting a spell, as you can't hear the verbal component. Additionally, spells like Find Familiar that allow you to shift your sight and hearing into something else means that you're, of course, blinded and deafened. This, again, should be advantageous because you're not affected by hearing determined effects, while your familiar can still observe from safe distance. While not as common, powerful, or flashy as some of the other conditions, this, like the prone condition, is very interesting as it has both beneficial and detrimental effects. And I think using this encourages players to be creative and has many untapped uses. This is Sean from Dodeca Dungeon, and this is the end of another episode of Conditions in D&D.